Good afternoon to you. Happy Wednesday. Cheers to you and your family. I hope you guys are having a wonderful day. Pastor Stecker here with Grace Lutheran Church, and welcome back as we continue our Bible study, Psalms, Prayers for the Journey of Life. What we've been doing here is we've been taking a psalm a day, we've been unpacking it, and after we've better understanding it, we've then been implementing it into our prayer life as soon as that night where we implement it into our comp line service. Now, here in our Bible study, we're going to be slightly pivoting. So whereas before you would see on the board Psalm 65, Psalm 100 or so, and we'd be breaking down that particular psalm, what we're going to be doing now is pivoting and looking at, we could call them themes, we could call them topics or concepts that prevail throughout a lot of the Psalms. And especially we're going to be looking at some of those concepts that might seem foreign to us, or might raise questions to us. And what we're going to be doing is taking one of those concepts and we're going to be breaking them down so we better understand them, so that when we come across certain terminology, certain phrases, certain frames of mind, we better know how to understand that and interpret it. And one of the illustrations that I always like to use when we're approaching some of these topics, like today and tomorrow especially, is there's always this pie chart of things that we understand in the Bible. And there might be, let's say, 60% that when you look at it, you say, that makes perfect sense, because it coincides with the way we naturally think, or at least the way that our culture thinks. And therefore, when we hear some things, like love thy neighbor as thyself, even though we may struggle doing that, we say, yeah, I know that I should love my neighbor as myself. Even though that frustrates me, that makes sense, right? However, there's this other 40% in the pie chart, where maybe 20% seems a little bit foreign to us, and then another 20% seems really foreign. And it's really helpful for us to dive into that other 40% of things that we encounter in the Bible, and in some ways it shocks us, or in some ways it challenges our common conceptions and our cultural perspective. And the book that I'm going to be heavily relying on is C.S. Lewis's book, Reflections on the Psalms. There it is right there. Great book so far. I've just started it. And to be honest with you, I didn't know that this book existed. Some of you who are members here at Grace know that I love C.S. Lewis, maybe in an unhealthy way, but I've never come across this book, and I found this actually in one of the resources. I was reading an article on one of the Psalms, and they said that C.S. Lewis wrote a book on the Psalms. So I went ahead and ordered it. And what he does is he breaks down some of the themes in the Psalms, at least in the first half of this book. And he kind of contemplates and says, well, why is that the case? And then he works to unpack that. And it's a very healthy thing to do. So we're going to be taking the lead from Lewis, and we're going to be pulling in some different examples from the Psalms to break down specific topics. Now, the one that we're going to be looking at today is judgment in the Psalms. So we might have an understanding of what the word judgment means, or what the word justice means. These two are very much connected. But what we're going to notice, and maybe you've already noticed this before, is that when you read through the Psalms, you might get a different picture of the understanding of the psalmist and his understanding of judgment, justice, and righteousness. So what I want to do is unpack that so that we have a better understanding of what the perspective and what the biblical and therefore godly truth that is being presented to us in those Psalms when judgment is present. So we can better understand that, so that we can enjoy the Psalms with a little more fluidity. Now, to give you an example of the understanding of justice presented in the Psalms, let me give you just a few Bible verses here. Here we go. All right. For example, you'll hear Psalms like this. In Psalm 67, verse 4, you hear, "O let the nations rejoice and be glad, for thou shalt judge the folk righteously." And elsewhere you have, "Let the field be joyful, all the trees of the wood shall rejoice before the Lord, for he cometh to judge the earth." And elsewhere you'll hear people actually ask for judgment. They'll say, "Judge me, O Lord my God, according to thy righteousness." Now, what I want you to notice in these is this may sound a little bit different than the way we often speak of judgment as 21st century Christians. And the reason is, normally when we think of judgment as Christians, we think of this. We think of the picture of us before God, and God judging us, and us, of course, not living up to his standards because of our sinful nature. And therefore, we sometimes ask, God, don't judge me according to my sins. So why is it that all throughout the Psalms, you'll hear the psalmist say, Lord, please come and judge. We beg for you to come and be a judge. Judge the righteous. Why is this the case? Well, that's what we're going to unpack. And what we're going to find is that our Christian understanding of God being a judge who judges all of us, and none of us are found righteous, and the psalmist's understanding, where they often cry out and say, Lord, I am righteous, please come and judge this situation, that these are not actually opposed to each other, but they're complementary. And by better understanding the way the psalmist uses judgment, we have actually a more clear picture of the biblical understanding. So, we're going to break this up into 3 parts as we unpack this. First, we're going to look at the criminal and civil case. Second, we're going to look at the standards of justice that are put forth. And 3, why it matters. We get some really beautiful takeaways and some things for us to reflect on that C.S. Lewis brings us to here in his chapter where he looks on judgment. So, let's begin. All right, so the first thing we're looking at here is understanding the criminal and the civil case. And the goal here is to start to unpack and maybe understand better the Jewish understanding of judgment as it's being used in the Psalms and how it might differ from the way we normally use the term judgment as Christians. And here's probably the best way I can explain the difference. Normally, we as Christians, when we think of judgment, we're thinking of a criminal case. In other words, we're thinking of ourselves as the defendant, right? We're the one who's before God, and we're going to be called either guilty or not guilty. And if we have any kind of self-honesty, we look at ourselves and we say, well, we are sinful and unclean, right? So us on our own, standing before God here in a criminal case, we're going to be found guilty. So our cry as Christians is always for God not to judge us based on what we've done, but rather, of course, we look to Christ, who is the one who steps in and he takes our sins and makes us clean. So our whole Christian understanding is us as being the defendant. However, what you're going to find if you read through the Psalms, and we found this in a lot of the Psalms that we've looked at already, is that the psalmist sounds like he's looking at this very differently. And he's calling on God to bring a proper judgment. And we look at that as Christians sometimes, and we say, well, why would you want to do that, right? Because if we stand before God, we're all going to be found guilty. As Paul says, not one will be found righteous. But the psalmists continually say, I want you to judge me, Lord. Judge us as righteous. What's going on here? Well, here's one of the big differences. Is from their perspective, they're seeing it as a civil case. In other words, it's not about them standing before God as being righteous or not righteous in all of their actions in life, but they're talking about a particular case between them and somebody else, and they're calling on God to be the righteous judge and to bring proper justice. Because what they experience in this world is that there's a lot of situations where there are unjust rulers, and unjust rulers end up mistreating and oppressing people. And because of that, people cry out from those situations and they say, God, we need a righteous judge to come and make this situation right. Now, one of the best examples of this, if we can turn to the New Testament, is probably right there in Luke 18. And it's the story, it's sometimes called the persistent widow. It's other times called the unjust judge. And what basically happens here is it's a parable that Jesus tells, and it's of this persistent widow who's being mistreated, right? She's someone who's downtrodden in the community. She's a widow, and somebody has been taking advantage of her monetarily, right? And she keeps going to this judge, and this earthly judge is unjust. And the picture you get is of someone who's downtrodden, looking for justice for a situation where they're being taken advantage of, and the unjust judge won't give them justice. Now, the story, of course, ends with the parable that as the woman continues to come back, the unjust judge eventually actually gives in and treats her case correctly. Now, the key takeaway from this is this paints a picture of just an extreme earthly reality that in most times and places in history, justice is something that is not at the forefront of a society. In most times and places in history, in order to get your case heard, you would have to bribe people just to get into the courtroom, and usually the whole legal system was extremely flawed. To be honest, we should really value the fact that we have a judicial system that, although it's not perfect, it's certainly not one where you have to bribe your way just to get your case heard. And we would say that most judges here in the United States are pretty just as far as earthly standards go. But that's not the case across the world. In many places in the world, and I've been to some of them, maybe some of you have as well, you have to bribe just to get your case heard. And even the police force is kind of unjust. I've been in Africa where if you want to get from one place to the other, cops will often just pull you over and say, well, you're going to have to pay me to continue on this road, or else I might take you to jail. Right? These are unjust situations, and they end up taking advantage. And what you're seeing here is from the psalmist's perspective, they are calling out to God to be a righteous judge and to take care of this injustice. So, the key takeaway here for this first point is to understand what's going on from the Jewish perspective when they say, God, come and judge us who are righteous. What they're saying is, in this situation, we are just. And it's that we, as Christians, we understand this civil justice, and we do cry out, right along with the psalmist, for God to come and bring justice in a world that is very unjust and where people often get taken advantage of. And this is a different way that we use the term justice and a different way that we use the term judgment than our common Christian understanding, where we do say, God, don't judge me for my sins. All right. So now we're going to move on to the second point, which is the standard of justice. And basically, we're going to be we're going to be outflowing straight from this first point to better understand the distinction between, we could say, our common Christian understanding of judgment and the Jewish understanding of judgment, and remembering that these are not opposites of each other, right? They complement each other, and by better understanding the one, we better understand the other. Now, C.S. Lewis, in his chapter on this, he breaks this down, and he does so in a very good way. And this is what he says. He says, "For what alarms us in the Christian picture is the infinite purity of the standard against which our actions will be judged. Then we know that none of us will ever come up to that standard. We are all in the same boat." Now see, right there, Lewis articulates very well our Christian understanding. That whether or not I'm somebody who is downtrodden, or I'm somebody who oppresses somebody else, no matter who we are, if we're looking at God's standard, right? In other words, the way that we are as human beings really supposed to live our life, we deeply understand in our Christian faith that none of us live up to God's standards. Because God's standards, of course, have to be perfect. And we want them to be perfect because we want to go to heaven, right? We want to go to a place that we would say is perfect. We want to go to a place where God does not lower the standards. We want to go to a place where the standards are perfect, right? So first, when we're approaching God, no one is just and no one's better than anybody else, okay? That's our first understanding. But then Lewis takes us forward and he says, but there's another aspect of judgment and justice and standards that we also have to understand. Hear what he has to say. He says, now the Jewish picture of civil action sharply reminds us that perhaps we are faulty not only by the divine standard, but also by a very human standard, which all reasonable people admit, and which we ourselves usually wish to enforce upon others. Now, do you see that? Lewis then takes us to a very reasonable thing that we do within our lives, and that is that we all have agreed upon understanding of how we go about our daily lives on specific topics. And what he says is, none of us live up to God's standards, but we also have standards that we're supposed to live up to with each other. These are much lower, they're much more manageable, but he's going to draw us to the fact that even on these standards, we often and hardly ever do live up to it. But this sets the stage for our understanding of the civil case, where we can have real judgments on whether or not people have lived up to things like laws or community guidelines or guidelines within families. Now, to help us understand this term, I want us to take a look at the actual definition that's given to us in our Bible dictionary on how judgment is defined. Listen to the definition that's given. Divinely righteous action, whether taken by humanity or God, that promotes equality among humanity. It's used in relation to uplifting the righteous and the oppressed and debasing the unrighteous and the oppressors. Now, what's interesting in that definition is you see that this judgment is something that's used both by God and it's also used by humanity, and especially human authorities. And the whole goal of this judgment, which serves justice, is to help lift up those who are in the right in situations and those who are being oppressed, and to tear down or to punish those who are being unrighteous or those who are oppressing other people. Now, the important thing here is to notice that God, of course, enacts this kind of justice, but also he has given the authority over to us as humans, and especially our governing authorities or our church authority, to be able to govern and judge on these situations, to help those who are being oppressed and to help those who are being right within situations, and then to punish those who are being wrong. And I want to use this as the framework to help us understand a question or a comment that maybe I've often heard, maybe you've heard it before, and it comes from a really good place, but it's this idea that as Christians, we're not supposed to judge anybody. Now, that's not true. What we're not supposed to do is to stand in the place of God and make divine judgments, right? We don't say, so-and-so cannot be righteous before God, but I am righteous before God. That's not what we say, right? Because we understand that they are only going to be made righteous, just as I'm only going to be made righteous, by the forgiveness that comes from Jesus' body and blood, by him taking our sins, right? So we never take the place of God, but God has given us rules and regulation and governing authorities that have the power, and not only that, but they are called to do. We as Christians are absolutely called to be able to make judgments against that which is unrighteous, for that which is righteous, against those who oppress, and in favor of those who are being oppressed. Not only are we allowed to do that, but we are actually called to do that. Okay? So the important thing here with point 2 is that we have these standards of justice, and we have God's standard, which none of us live up to, and we understand that, right? And in that way, we would all be judged according to our sin if it weren't for Christ. But we also have these civil or these worldly standards that we are called to live up to, and when people do not live up to those standards, then there are punishments, there are judgments in place, and that is so that we can have a more just and more righteous society. And of course, it's never perfect this side of heaven, but we do appreciate as Christians just law, right? And just standards and just morality that we try to push within our communities, within our lives, and within our families. Last, we're going to move on to our third point, which is, why does this matter? And that's a big box to unpack. There's obviously a lot there, but I'm going to focus on just 2 aspects that Lewis gives us to really reflect on as examples of how justice manifests itself and ultimately makes us reflect on our own lives and the way that we deal with others, and the importance of understanding justice within those situations and within our life. The first example he gives is that it's important to uphold justice on an individual case-by-case basis, and how this is very important to do. And he uses an example which, to be honest, I think us parents often fail at, and basically that we need to uphold justice within every situation where there's a dispute, we could say, between kids. He gives an example of Charlie and Tommy, and the picture he paints is that Charlie is normally the one who's ornery, and he's normally the one who's misbehaved, to whereas Tommy is normally behaved very well. And in this situation, Tommy has taken Charlie's pencil, and Charlie protests and says, "But Tommy took my pencil." And what Lewis points out is that often, he was a teacher for a while, he says often what we're prone to do as teachers or as parents is to judge the character of the 2 individuals and say to Charlie, well, maybe it's fine that Tommy has your pencil for a while. But, he says, this is actually an injustice, because the just thing would be for Charlie, whose pencil was stolen by Tommy, to have the pencil given back to him. But what he says was, we end up pulling in something called charity, and we end up having that supersede justice. In other words, we say, well, this is a good time to just teach Charlie that it's fine to share pens with people sometimes. Lewis's point is that while charity is something that's important to teach, that there was a cry out in this point where Charlie rightfully cried out for justice, and they called upon a parent or a teacher to be the judge and to say that stealing someone's pen is not right. Now, do you see the difference there? We need to act and by that case-by-case basis and say the just thing is for the person who stole the pencil to give it back. But often what we do is we say, well, Charlie's usually the one acting out, so Charlie, just deal with it for right now. He says we do a serious injustice to the individual when we act unjustly, or we decide unjustly for that case. That was something that really made me reflect on how I often deal with people, especially with those who I'm teaching, more so with kids. I wonder what your reflection is on that situation. Please feel free to share, either in the comments below or on our virtual narthex. And now moving forward to another one, which I just think he was absolutely brilliant on. And ultimately what he says, the whole point of all of this, the biggest takeaway, is to understand that on these civil cases, that we are often not living up to the standards that we set for other people. And he says the key takeaway as a Christian to use on this whole meditation is to now apply this to ourselves to help us reflect on how we do not live up to the standards that we set for other people. And he turns and uses an illustration, or really unpacks, a disagreement between two people. And he says, granted, normally disagreements, we would say we try our best to avoid it. He said, let's just take for granted that this disagreement is something that actually had to take place, right? It wasn't an unjust disagreement, but it's a real disagreement between two people. And basically he says, we need to ask the question, we need to reflect on the question after we've been in a quarrel, did we fight fair? Or in other words, did we go through that quarrel fair? Or did we go about it in an unjust way in order to get what we want? In other words, did we manipulate? I want to go ahead and share this quote with you. I think it's absolutely brilliant. It's a little bit on the longer side, so sit back, relax, grab some popcorn, and just enjoy this quote. Lewis says, did we pretend to be angry about one thing when we knew, or could have known, that our anger had a different and much less presentable cause? Did we pretend to be hurt in our sensitive and tender feelings, when envy, ungratified vanity, and thwarted self-will was our real trouble? He says, such tactics often succeed. The other party gives in. They give in not because they don't know what is really wrong with us, but because they have long known it only too well. And that sleeping dog can be roused only at the cost of imperiling their whole relationship with us. And so we win by cheating. But the unfairness is very deeply felt. Indeed, what is commonly called sensitiveness is the most powerful engine of domestic tyranny. How we should deal with it in others, I'm not sure, but we should be merciless to it, to its first appearance in ourselves. What's so brilliant about this is something that I think almost all of us would miss if it weren't pointed out to us. And that is that we can have a disagreement with someone, and often we can turn to showing that our feelings have been hurt, or showing that this topic makes us very sensitive and emotional. And you can almost call this the tyranny of sensitivity. And by doing so, we're overplaying our emotion in order to force or manipulate the other person to submit to our will. Lewis points out that this is extraordinarily unjust, but we often don't notice it in ourselves, but we certainly notice it in others. And the key here is to understand that if we win arguments by using these kind of tactics, rather than trying to let the truth win out, we are participating in injustice. And this must mercifully be thwarted out in ourselves. I'll go ahead and leave that as our takeaway, but the big overall takeaway is to understand and join in on the cry against injustice, both in others and in maybe our communities or in our nation or in other nations when we see it, because it is serious business, and we are called upon as Christians to judge those things. But ultimately what we do is we turn it back into ourselves and we try to see, where are we being unjust? Where are we mistreating or manipulating others? Where are we taking advantage of others, and how are we doing it? And we reflect on that. And by doing so, we can see where that poison is, and we can try to cut it out. Be merciless with it. I invite you to continue to read the Psalms and look and see where we watch the psalmist cry out for judgment, and reflect on the way that they phrase it and the way that they apply it to their own lives. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've learned a little bit about judgment in the Bible, and especially in the Psalms. I know I certainly have. God bless you. Have a wonderful day.